Right, well, a very warm welcome to all of you. A big thank you to Matthew Schepel for organizing this, and a very warm welcome to Professor Hans Lindahl. I'm going to say my compatriot, but we are both much more exotic than our Dutchness would seem. Hans has grown up in Colombia, went to law school there, got a philosophy degree there, worked in practice there, until he came to this here beautiful country to do his PhD in philosophy in Leuven, then stayed in academia, moved to the Netherlands, and spent most of his academic career in the philosophy department in Tilburg before he came to his senses and moved to the law faculty, which he's now taking over. He'll be the head of department from October on. And so we are profiting from the fact that he's still among academics and not managers for a few months, and he is going to talk a little bit about themes that he touched upon on his by now modern classic fault-lines globalization, speaking about the relationship between the ways we think about law and globalization processes. So a very warm welcome to Hans Lindahl.
What would be best? Probably that I stand there at the lectern? Or is it all right with you if I just sit down here? Yeah. Is it okay?
And I'll do this.
No, just let me use this. And is it, when I have to lecture to roughly 500 students in a large aula, so you develop a pretty stentorian voice after some time. Can you guys hear me back there? Because I prefer not to speak with a microphone if that's okay.
It's for recording purposes.
Oh,
no,
for recording purposes.
No, it's not.
It's
It's
not?
fine if you not
Oh,
use
okay,
it.
then no.
Okay, terrific. Let's see. There we go. Well, thanks very much for this great invitation. I really enjoyed being here with all of you. I'm heartened to see that not many of the PhDs who were in on the workshop this morning are here today. There's a couple of diehards, but that means that I don't feel particularly embarrassed about having some overlap between the discussion of this morning and what I'll be talking about today. But as I say, before getting started, just many thanks for this great invitation. Thanks for the impeccable organization of it, and I really enjoy being here. What I'd like to talk with you about today is about a book I wrote a year and a half back, which was published under the title "Fault Lines of Globalization: Politics, or rather legal order, and the politics of illegality." And I'm just going to pick out some of the issues that I've dealt with in that book to discuss them with you. And it's part of work in progress in my own interests in terms of legal philosophy. Maybe it's because I am very much of a nomad, having moved around, that the problems of boundaries really fascinate me. And one of the issues in law, which remarkably actually is not particularly well developed theoretically, is a problem of the relationship between law and boundaries. And so what I'll be talking to you about today is basically this problem. But I'm not going to speak about boundaries. I'm going to say that boundaries, and that's the main title of the lecture, boundaries manifest themselves as boundaries in a normal sense of the term. So for example, this door here is a boundary that separates the hallway from this space. So you cross boundaries, and in that sense, what boundaries always will do is join and separate. But what I will also try to make an argument for is that under certain conditions, boundaries will appear as limits, and in other conditions as fault lines. And so I'm going to try to develop a three-way distinction between boundaries, limits, and fault lines. And I'm going to link that up at the end of the talk to the notion of what this might mean for democracy in a global context. Briefly, a summary of the lecture. I'll parse the lecture into 7 parts. To begin with, I will be focusing a great deal on the problem of space, spatial boundaries. These are not the only kinds of boundaries that legal orders have, but they are in a certain sense the kinds of boundaries which are most visible and also most invisible in the course of processes of globalization. So I'll begin by asking a key question are we really moving beyond the inside-outside distinction, as we are told by just about all sociologists of legal globalization, in the process of moving beyond state law? That will be my first question, and my answer will be no. I think that the inside-outside distinction remains very much at stake in processes of globalization. I will try to justify why that is the case by sketching an understanding of law in terms of what I will call authoritative collective action. If you understand law as authoritative collective action, or so I will argue, then that helps us to understand why we cannot make sense of law, not even a global legal order, not even a global legal order of human rights, without an outside as well as an inside. Then I will go ahead and introduce the three-way distinction, which is of cardinal importance to the lecture and to the book, the distinction between legality, illegality, and a technical term which I will introduce, which I dub illegality. And whereas legality and illegality allow me to introduce the notion of the boundaries of legal orders, the notion of and the experience of illegality, which I will illustrate, allows me to introduce the distinction between boundaries as limits and boundaries as fault lines. Then I will illustrate this with a case that comes from my own country, from Colombia. It's an indigenous people called the Uwa, and their way of contesting what would be a typical example of global law, as understood, for example, by Günther Teubner, lex constructionis as part and parcel of lex mercatoria. Then I will draw the implications of this analysis for globalization, or more precisely globalizations in the plural, and I will wind up the talk with some references to democracy and what I would call the politics of boundaries. So that's the agenda. Let's begin with inside-outside distinction. And let me narrate to you a short story, which is actually what got this book going, which I wrote. And this incident happened to me and my partner. We were at a restaurant in a town called Breda, not so far from Tilburg, at an Indonesian restaurant, to not name any names, it's called Sindaraya. And it was a very nice environment. People were just chatting, enjoying the evening. I remember it was a late summer evening. And then suddenly a clochard walked in. It was a big, burly guy. He stank. He looked disheveled. And we made a beeline for the main waiter and said, "I want a meal." And it was clear that this guy would brook no nonsense. He wanted a meal and he would not be paying for it. And because it was an Indonesian restaurant, and there was also a cultural aspect of this, the owners and the waiters were Indonesians, slight figures, very polite, as Indonesians tend to be. And so a certain sort of pall settled over the room, because you could see that people were just actually getting a bit nervous about what was going to happen. And you could see that the waiter's brain was churning like mad. What was he going to do? Because he wasn't large enough himself to take the guy out. He'd have to call the police. And if he called the police, just the whole thing would fall apart. So what he ended up doing was inviting this waiter to come and sit at a table, which happened to be next to our table and was a table immediately next to the kitchen. So he sat down, and then the atmosphere became once again, as one would say in Dutch, gezellig, and everyone forgot about the guy. And then something literally extra-ordinary took place. And that is that when the waiter brought the guy his meal, the clochard, with a cherubic smile, looked at the waiter and invited him to sit down to share the meal with him. And you could literally see that the waiter he didn't know how to physically react to that. He was physically disoriented in the invitation to sit down to have dinner. And of course, what you saw happening there was an interruption of a legal order. And it was an interruption in 4 different senses. What you saw happening there is that the roles that one would typically play were being interrupted. So you would have, typically, if you walk into a restaurant, you're a client. And so if you're a client, then you will have waiters, you will have owners. So the law creates different roles, subjectivities, but it also creates a space. The restaurant is a specific kind of a place. It's one thing to have a loo, it's another thing to have a restaurant, I hope. And so, in a sense, what the guy was doing is disarticulating or disordering the subjectivities which are at stake in a restaurant. He was also disordering the kinds of behavior that you engage in a restaurant, because he was walking in to have a dinner, but he wasn't paying for the dinner. So he was also, in a certain sense, disordering the place as a restaurant, because the restaurants in a capitalist system, at least, is a place where you walk in, order a dinner, pay for it, and walk away. And he was also disordering the temporal structure, because basically what you would do as a client is you walk in, you sit down, you order, you eat, you stand up, you pay, and you leave. He was disordering that because he was not following that sequence. And so what suddenly became clear to me, in a sense, was that what law does, it's not the only social order that does that, but it's certainly a specific social order that does that. What law does is to order space, to order time, to order subjectivities, and to order contents of acts. All of these together at the same time. And what this guy was doing was interrupting that. And so the question is, where was the guy coming from when he walked into the restaurant? In a certain sense, he was of course coming from outside, in the sense from the street. And so in a certain sense, the restaurant is in a continuum with the sidewalk, with the street, with the city, with the country in which that restaurant is situated. But in a certain sense, he was also coming from another place that was outside the Dutch legal order. In his behavior, in a certain sense, what he was showing us, that there is another way of ordering the space of a social order, in such a way that a restaurant would be a place where you could sit down to eat without paying for a meal. And so in a sense, he was both inside that Dutch legal order and he was outside it. His act of, with a cherubic smile, inviting the waiter to sit down to have dinner with him, took place in a place that has no place in the Dutch legal order. And so what this guy was doing was contesting the spatial, the temporal, the subjective, and the content boundaries that makes law into the order that it is. What does this have to do with globalization? Well, you would say nothing. Well, I would say it's actually the other way around. It has everything to do with globalization. Because most of you will have heard that mantra about Westphalia. The idea being that ever since Westphalia, the treaties of Westphalia, what we have is the state as a paradigmatic legal order, which is organized in terms of the domestic and the foreign. And therefore, ever since Westphalia, even if we have international law, which is not organized as an inside and an outside, nonetheless, it is ordered with a view to ensuring that states are an inside vis-a-vis an outside, which is the rest of the world. And so what we're hearing is that with the emergence of globalization, the inside-outside distinction is basically a merely contingent feature of the law, and nothing that the law is essentially about. That global legal orders, think of the WTO, think of human rights law, think of cyber law, think of any of a host of legal orders. These are legal orders, and nonetheless it makes no sense to organize them in terms of a spatial closure that would be constituted for these legal orders. And so the challenge, this is part of the story, is to make sense of law in a way that says goodbye definitively to the idea that we need to understand law in terms of a spatial closure. I would beg to differ from that view. What I think that this specific case shows us is that we need to draw a distinction between two forms of the inside-outside distinction. One is the distinction between the domestic and the foreign. And of course it makes sense to say that what globalization shows us is that we can envisage, and in fact already see unfolding before our eyes, forms of law which are not spatially organized in terms of the domestic and the foreign. As I said, think of the World Trade Organization, think perhaps of cyber law, lex mercatoria, etc. That form of the inside-outside distinction is contingent. But there's another more fundamental form of the inside-outside distinction, which I would claim is not contingent, and that's a distinction between the inside as a place a collective claims as its own space, and an outside in the form of the strange, where the strange speaks to a kind of order that has no place within that legal order, and yet nonetheless also interferes with its unrolling. And so my claim would be, we can imagine, for example, the WTO as not having an outside in terms of foreign spaces, but I would argue that the WTO certainly has an outside in terms of strange places. Think of all the forms of contestation which are around of the World Trade Organization as a way of organizing the world as a common market. So what became clear to me is that there is actually very little in the way of theoretical inquiries, both in political theory and in legal theory, into the relationship between legal orders and their boundaries, including their spatial boundaries. And I think there's a good reason for this. As I mentioned this morning in the workshop for the PhDs, typically legal philosophy and legal theory would say that there are two compartments of interest for legal theory. One is what's called the identity question, and the second one is the individuation question. The identity question is a question about what is law as a specific legal order, so normative order. So, for example, what's the difference between law and morality? What's the difference between law and religion? That's a question that most legal philosophers find interesting and that they will obsessively engage with. So think, for example, of the huge debate between legal positivism and all kinds of variations on legal theories of natural law about the separability of law and morality. Some who will say, yes, we can make sense of law without morality. Others will say, no, we can't make sense of law without morality. So that's a question which has obsessed legal theorists. But the second question is one which has been basically shunted aside and deposited on the work desks of legal sociologists. That's the individuation question. And the idea here is, when you speak about individuation, what you're asking is, how is it possible to identify a legal order as being, say, the Belgian legal order, or the Dutch legal order, or as lex mercatoria, or as a WTO? How do you individuate? That would say, how do you pick out a specific legal order as a legal order that it is? Now, the standard view of legal theorists is to say, well, look, that's a question that's interesting for legal sociologists because it has to do with the different contents of orders, but it doesn't tell us what law is about in its inner structure. I disagree. What I'm trying to do in the course of this book and in my current research is to actually say perhaps there is an inner connection between what makes law into law and the problem of boundaries. If it is the case that what legal orders do is to order behavior, then they order behavior by drawing boundaries within which behavior should take place. And if that's what they're doing, then this should also help us to understand what's specific to law as a form of normative ordering vis-a-vis other forms of normative ordering. So what I'm doing is, instead of taking for granted that we should focus only on the identity question and leave the crumbs for the legal sociologists, what I'm arguing is that we need to begin with the individuation question and work our way towards the identity question. That's the basic setup of the book, and that's a general strategy which I've been following. And I hope that this will allow me to develop a general theory of legal order and of legal ordering. That is to say, a theory of law that helps to explain state law, certainly international law, but that could also, for example, make sense of cyber law, that could help me to make sense of the WTO, that could help me to make sense of nomadic law, that could help me to make sense of a host of orders that have been marginalized by legal theory's obsession with the state and international law, and to offer a comprehensive picture, both conceptual and normative, about what these legal orders are about. What would allow me to explain what happened with the vagrant, with the clochard, and what is that general concept of law which I'm trying to develop in the course of my current research? Well, It's the hypothesis that we can make sense of law and should make sense of law as what I would call authoritative collective action. That is to say that the genus of law is the notion of collective action, which I'll explain now, and that the species are structures of authority. If you have collective action and you add to that authoritative monitoring of collective action, I'll explain that to you in a minute, then my sense of the matter is that's a minimal, thin understanding of what law is about, which would make sense of a state, it would make sense of international law, make sense of nomadism, cyber law, WTO, etc. So let's begin with law with the genus with collective action. What I'm asking you to do is to make a switch and to leave behind, to a certain extent, what has become an obsession with us in modernity, and that's the individual. There's something that is called methodological individualism, which was propitiated by Max Weber, amongst others. And the idea there is that to make sense of action, we have to take care of making sense of the position of an individual who acts, even if the individual is interacting with other persons. So in a certain sense, modern theories of action, and also modern philosophies of action, have been very much focused on the first person singular I. Now, what collective action theories of an analytical provenance have suggested is that without relinquishing the importance of the I, the notion of the we that acts is not reducible to the aggregation of, or the summation of a number of we's. To borrow Margaret Gilbert's lovely distinction, we need to make a distinction between we each and we together. So let me give you an example. Suppose that after the lecture, many of us were to go to the station down here at Eterbeek to catch the train back to Central Station or wherever. And that there were a Martian who were to arrive who had never seen humanity, had never seen what a train was or a train station. And by our good fortune and his or her misfortune, they landed there on the platform of Eterbeek and saw this milling group of people just, waiting for the train as it happened. So that person, that Martian, would knock on, say, my back or my shoulder and say, "What are you doing?" Then I might say, "Well, we are waiting for the train." Now, it makes a huge difference if we're doing this together or if each one of us is waiting for the train on his or her own. Suppose that the train arrives. Suppose also that all of you step on board the train and that for some reason, maybe I'm smoking my last cigarette, I haven't noticed that the train is ready to leave. And you see that the doors are just ready to leave, that the door, that the train is just hovering to depart. And you guys there didn't like my lecture, so rubbing your hands in glee, seeing what's going to happen. The door closes, the train leaves, I spin on my heels, I say, "What the fuck?" And you guys wave at me. And I would, of course, be annoyed, but I would have no standing to rebuke you for not having told me that the door was going to close. Another story would be if after having this lecture, the idea would be that Kent were to invite us to go to visit a museum, and then if one of us were distracted and hadn't noticed that the door was going to close on the train, and the train actually left without us, that person would be entitled to not only be annoyed, but to rebuke us. Because if we were going to the museum together, then basically we should be helping each other out so that we can do that which our action is about, which is to visit a museum. Now, what I want to say is that law, the genus of law, is the notion of we together. That is to say, there's a point to our legal institutions, whether it be marriage, whether it be whatever institution that we can speak about in the law, that what we call legal rules are a default setting of that point of action, and that law generates what you might want to call relational or directed obligations. Obligations which are oriented to specific individuals who are also participating in collective action. This would be obviously the case in contract, but not only in the case of contract. And this means that the kind of standing and rebukes that you have collective action with respect to individuals that don't perform in accordance with what is expected of them to realize collective action, and the kinds of rebukes that you can level against those who misperform, that the sanctions that you have in law and obligations which are generated by law are understandable in the framework of the idea that what law is about in general is a form of acting we together, joint action. Now, this is of course still only the genus. What I would want to say is that what helps us to make sense of law as a specific kind of collective action is the notion of structures of authority. What I want to say there is that what authority is about in the case of law is about the monitoring and the upholding, where you see there on the sheet, upholding collective authority, should be saying upholding collective action. I'm sorry about that. What I would want to say is that law, qua authoritative structure, is about monitoring the point and the consistency of collective action. So you will have authorities who will be deciding for all of us what it is that we're doing together, for example, in the case of conflict. If, for example, there's a conflict about contract, then we will go to a judge who will in principle decide which party has a rightful claim, but that judge will do so on the basis of contract law, and more generally, on the basis of what it is that we understand contract as doing in terms of the broader collectivity which we are as, say, the Belgian state. So, at the moment that you introduce the monitoring of the point and consistency of collective action by way of the generation of general and individualized norms, you have a first aspect of what is crucial to a legal order. And add to that the notion that what you're doing is upholding collective action when its consistency and viability over time are undermined or otherwise threatened. Then, with these two features, monitoring and upholding collective action, I would say that that's where you have a legal order. And you can, of course, have nested legal orders. So, for example, the example of the clochard, there already you have a form of collective action, which would be, say, a restaurant, but that restaurant is itself nested in a higher order form of collective action, which finally is the state of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So you will have nested forms of collective action, and it's also the case that we will never be able to spell out fully what it is that we're doing together. In the process of acting together, there will always be new questions which arise of what it is that our collective is about. And that's where authorities enter the picture, by authoritatively deciding, whether by individual norms or by general norms, what it is that our action ought to be about. Okay, so this is the background on the basis of which I want to begin to introduce the three-way distinction between legality, illegality, and illegality, and a distinction that will also allow me to introduce the three-way classification or differentiation between what I call boundaries, limits, and fault lines. Now, as I was mentioning this morning in the workshop, one of the fascinating things about engaging with law as a professional is that you're taught that law is the unity of a manifold of norms. So when I studied law in Colombia, the first thing you had to do was buy your civil code, you had to buy a constitution, you had to buy all the different codes in which the law was enacted. And then basically what you did is you studied the codes, and you learned, and that's a great deal of what the training of what it is to be a lawyer is about. You learn to make sense of the unity of the law in terms of its different institutions, etc. But in the understanding that what law is about is a systematic unity of norms. And you can expand that, for example, as Ronald Dworkin does, to include certain standards and principles. But the idea is basically law is about rules in abstracto, and which you abstract from daily practice. And in that sense, it doesn't make a difference if you're steeped in common law or if you're steeped in continental law. Basically, we are trained to view law as unity norms. That's what you see Hans Kelsen do in his Reine Rechtslehre. That's also what Hart does. It's also, at the end of the day, what Ronald Dworkin does. It's a quite prevalent understanding of what law is about. Now, my sense of the matter is, on that basis of that understanding of law, I could not really explain what happened in that restaurant in Breda. It wouldn't make much sense to say that what the clochard was doing was calling into question certain legal rules about what constitutes a contract of service. You could, that would be the lawyerly take on it, but that was certainly not what those people there understood as what was happening, and certainly not what the clochard understood as doing. So we need to transform our understanding of what it is that law is about to make sense of that experience. And the law actually allows us to do so, because typically legal theorists will make a distinction between four spheres of validity of legal norms. And in fact, in legal practice, you will make distinctions between the four dimensions of competence of, for example, a judge. So you will distinguish between the spatial sphere of validity, the temporal sphere of validity, the subjective sphere of validity, and the material sphere of validity. That is to say, a legal norm and legal orders in general will in principle be applicable in a certain space, during a certain time, for certain individuals, and regarding certain acts. Now, I use this four-way distinction of the spheres of validity as a window to climb into another understanding of what law is about. And that is to say that what the spheres of validity are about is the way that lawyers make sense of what legal orders actually do. And that is to order space, time, subjectivity, and acts. And so basically, when I say that law is authoritative collective action, what I'm inviting you to do is to take up the first-person perspective of individuals and of the collectives, in which space is organized in a certain way, in which temporal sequences unfold in a certain way, in which certain subject positions are made possible. So, for example, client, waiter, but not someone who enters and orders food but doesn't pay for it, and certain kinds of acts. So what law does is to order space by creating places and therefore differentiating places, but also unifying them. It differentiates time in terms of temporal sequences and then also unifies it. It creates different subjectivities and unifies them. So if you're a waiter, then you have, in principle, also as a correlate, a client, etc. And it also orders by differentiating and unifying interlocking acts. This allows me to suggest that first and foremost, and here's an expression I'm drawing from a dodgy political and legal philosopher called Carl Schmitt, who you may know as having been one of the crown jurists of the Nazi regime till he was found to be insufficiently Nazi, but who was an abject person. And usually it's not bon ton to engage with Carl Schmitt, but the problem is that he's just a fantastic philosopher. And so you just can't avoid him. And in a number of interesting texts, he has described law as being a concrete order. Now, I don't by any stretch of the imagination buy everything that Schmitt takes over. My preferred strategy is to use Schmitt against Schmitt. And so what I'm interested in showing is his notion of law as being a concrete order is right, and it can be developed in a way that we can use against Schmitt. And so my claim is that law is indeed a concrete order in the sense that what law is about is ordering who ought to do what, where, and when, and having an authoritative system in place that is able of monitoring who ought to do what, where, and when, and enforcing who ought to do where and when. And so that's a quite different approach to law than the approach that would say that law is a unity of norms. You can do it. Lawyers would typically, in this kind of a situation that I described with the clochard, say probably this guy was acting in an extortive way with respect to the restaurant. And then you already begin to focus on the norms. But that process of focusing on the norms is a second order activity, which presupposes that day-to-day practice in which people go to restaurants, buy meals, etc., etc. And so what I would want to say is that if the basic distinction as systems theory has correctly pointed out in law is a distinction between legality and illegality, then what I want to say that the boundaries of legality and illegality are indeed the spatial, the temporal, the subjective, and the material boundaries of behavior. So that person's behavior may be illegal because he breached a spatial boundary by entering a restaurant to do something that he shouldn't be doing there, etc. So the boundaries of space, time, etc. are the boundaries of legality and illegality, and vice versa. Now what this means is that what boundaries do for legal orders is to help us make sense of the distinction between legal order and legal disorder. Legal disorder is when someone crosses or breaches a boundary, and usually it will be a breach that is both spatial, temporal, subjective, and content-wise. So the distinction between legality and illegality is a distinction between legal order and legal disorder. And the way in which concretely we want to qualify behavior as being legal or illegal is in terms of the boundaries that law draws up for such behavior. Now what is interesting is that, of course, we as lawyers are obsessed by legality and illegality, but in a certain sense, they are two of a kind. When you speak of illegality, that's simply a negative way of formulating what it is that you want people to do. So in a certain sense, illegality is a derivative with respect to the notion of legality. It has no independent status. And that is also to say that legal boundaries will join and separate within the unity of a legal order. So, for example, we can make the distinction between the foreign and the domestic, the Belgian and the Dutch legal order, simply because both legal orders are part of a larger legal order, which is the order of international law. So here you see already the function of boundaries. Boundaries join and they separate, but boundaries cannot join and separate without already a more encompassing unity with respect to which these places can be assigned as different places. And so what I want to say is that we cannot imagine a legal order, not even a global legal order, that could avoid setting boundaries in this fourfold sense to human behavior. Even a global order of human rights would in one way or another have to say who ought to do where, what, where, and when. So if that is what boundaries are about, and therefore legality and illegality, let us now move into the key notion of illegality, which allows me to introduce the notion of limits and fault lines. Now, I said that what collective action does is organize behavior of individuals in such a way that we do something together. That is to say, what our action is about. So it can be something very trivial. It can be, for example, painting a house together. So what it is that we're doing together is the point of action. Now, because collective action has a point, that which is what it is about, that means that collective action will single out certain kinds of behavior as being relevant and important with a view to realizing the point of joint action, and other things which are irrelevant and important thereto. So for example, if we're painting a house together, then whether or not I hand over the bucket of paint to the guy who's up there on the ladder painting is certainly relevant and important. But for example, whether I'm at the same time listening to music or not, that's irrelevant to that collective act. And so, because collective action has a point, collective action will draw a distinction between what is relevant and important and what is irrelevant and important in view of that normative point. And here's where boundaries begin to show what's at stake in law. What law will do is include, in terms of what's important and relevant, and exclude in the sense that everything that is unimportant, irrelevant, is part of what it simply remains unordered for that order. It simply doesn't count. It's not important. But that domain of what remains unordered for the law is the domain from which you can have behavior that will question or call into question the criteria on the basis of which an order decides what is important and what isn't. And so what I want to say is that what I call illegality is behavior that calls into question what a legal order defines as important and what it defines as unimportant. And that is to say that it's behavior that contests both poles of legality and illegality. What a legal behavior does is to call into question what a legal order will call legal and what it will call illegal at the same time. And what you're then questioning is whether we are a collective, to a certain extent at least, and what it is that we are as a collective. That we are a collective in the sense it suddenly appears that there was a member here who we thought was a member of a collective and who's suddenly behaving in a way that shows us he or she doesn't understand herself as being part of that we. And that moment of experience that here was someone who we took for granted as part of the we and suddenly proves to not be understanding him or herself as part of that we is always unsettling. It always confronts us with the question, are we a we? But it's not only are we a we, it is also a question, what are we as a we? Who are we as a collective? And this is the experience of the contingency of the law. Contingency, the experience of contingency in the law, which comes to the fore in what I call illegality, is the experience of the contingency of our understanding of that we are a collective and what we are as a collective. And that means that legal orders are having to respond in one way to another to that illegal condition. Sometimes in extremely visible ways, sometimes in a much more evanescent way, the law is continuously confronted with challenges to how it draws the distinction between legality and illegality. And it will have to respond to it, either by ignoring it, but even ignoring is already a way of responding, or by adjusting itself to meet the challenge, even if the adjustment is a partial adjustment and when it doesn't take you the whole way of the challenge. So what I would want to say is that what law is about is not only a process of ordering, but that it's ordering in the sense of a continuous process of boundary setting. Law is continuously setting boundaries in terms of who ought to do what, where, and when, and in that sense it's always an indirect response to illegality. Now, the modes of appearance of illegality. What do I mean with that technical term? Well, when I speak about A with the emphasis on legality, what I want to say is that behavior has to be able to register as being either legal or illegal within the legal order. So, for example, in the case of the clochard, I think it's fair to say that most lawyers would, when confronted with that, say this guy is extorting the restaurant. He's deliberately using the situation to force the restaurant to give him a free meal because he knows that if the police will be called in, this will generate a very uncomfortable situation. This guy wants to have a free lunch and get away with it. That's extortion. So his behavior, in a sense, already registers in the legal order as illegal. But I think that it's also fair to say that for many people, it was not only merely a question of illegality. In a certain sense, there was also a challenge there. For example, the challenge to the question, to each according to his means. Maybe he was challenging that by saying, well, perhaps we should think of restaurants as allotting meals in terms of to each according to their needs. I needed a meal. And so that's where the moment of the A comes into the picture. It's not merely the negation of the legal order, it's showing the possibility that there's other ways of ordering space, subjectivities, and so forth. And so what I would want to say is, to come back to a distinction I introduced at the beginning, remember that I said there are two ways of the inside-outside distinction, the foreign and the domestic, and the strange and the own. What I would want to say is that the act of the clochard very quickly, evanescently, intimated a strange order. That is to say, another way of organizing the speciality of a legal order, one which interferes with the kind of speciality of a restaurant in a capitalist legal order. And what I want to say is that we are obsessed with the borders of our states, and certainly in a time of heavy immigration. And so I would say, of course, the borders are the kinds of boundaries that allow us to draw the distinction between the domestic and the foreign. what I want to say is that all spatial boundaries which are drawn by legal orders can appear as limits, in the sense that when the clochard came in, that door of that restaurant was not a border. It was not the distinction between the domestic and the foreign, but he was coming in from a strange place. The threshold of that restaurant was the threshold actually in the sense of Walter Benjamin, where you see a strange outside in a sort of evanescent manifestation thereof. What I want to say that all boundaries can appear as limits between, on the one hand, legal order and disorder, therefore legality and illegality, and the unordered, and in particular, the strange on the other side. Now, so there you have the domestic and the foreign and the familiar and the strange. And what's also interesting about the case is that with the clochard, what becomes clear is that it's not like the own is on this side of the domestic and the foreign is also strange. This guy was in the Dutch legal order and he was outside it. So the domestic, so the foreign need not be strange, the strange need not be foreign. They're irreducible to each other. And here's where I disagree, for example, with Smith. And so, going back to Westphalia, what I would want to say is that no legal order, not even a global legal order, is thinkable that is not organized as an inside vis-a-vis and outside in the form of the own and the strange. Imagine that we would have to formulate a global polity of some kind. Imagine, for example, that the climate change was becoming such a huge problem that we finally accepted that we could not deal with it in terms of the normal mechanisms of the international treaties. So we found a world polity. Now, however, when you look at it, that world polity would have to decide who ought to do what, where, and when, in terms of an understanding of the normative point of that action. But dollars to donuts that there will be people who will be in disagreement with that and will contest how the boundaries of that world polity will be formulated. So my claim is, even if we're moving beyond the inside-outside distinction in terms of the foreign and the domestic, we cannot move on beyond the inside and outside in terms of the own and the strange. Bear with me, I only have 3 hours to go. Boundaries as limits. In some cases, a legal behavior allows, and not, well, to a certain extent always, a legal behavior allows for reformulating, recalibrating the boundaries of a legal order, such that the challenge which is raised by a legal behavior can be accommodated in the legal order. So, for example, you could imagine, with the case of the clochard, that what you could do is, say, give clochards food stamps, so that they could go and have lunch at the restaurant of the Free University of Brussels when they wanted to. So there's a way of meeting the demands of the clochard. And to that extent, I would say that what boundaries do is manifest themselves as limits, in the sense that you can order what hasn't been ordered, you can include it in your legal order. And so what you're doing, saying, what the clochard confronts us with is possibilities of our own that we have not yet exploited, and that we would now want to exploit in terms of reconstituting collective action. But there's a stronger understanding of boundaries as boundaries, and that is boundaries as fault lines. And I speak of fault lines to refer to what I would call the partial incompossibility between the orders. To come back to the example of the clochard, whoever said that he actually even wanted to have a home, who said that he wanted to have the vouchers, maybe he's very comfortable with the kind of a life that he has and he doesn't want anything else. And what I mean, therefore, is that there are incompossibilities between legal order, in the sense that there are possibilities out there which are simply beyond the realm of possibilities that we could realize in a given legal order. Legal orders don't necessarily have a path dependency, but they do have to hold on to some understanding of identity over time, which limits the possibilities of a legal order to respond to challenges to that legal order. And in those cases, what appears is not merely the unordered as unordered but orderable, a limit, but the unordered as unorderable, that which we simply cannot accommodate in our legal order. And what then happens is that if you try to accommodate that, what you're frankly doing is reducing the strange to the familiar. And I want, nonetheless, to avoid anything like a la clash of civilizations. I don't think that works. I speak of partial incompossibilities. That is to say, what appears as illegal appears both as orderable and to a certain extent as unorderable. We can accommodate that, we can transform ourselves, and to that extent, it hits us. It's as it were a mirror that allows us to change ourselves. But it's not only that. There's something that will always, a residual strangeness that we do not accommodate in the legal order. And so what I want to say is that no legal order, global or otherwise, is thinkable absent limits and fault lines. We're moving towards the end now. Let me illustrate this with a particularly, I don't even know if the word is poignant, case of an indigenous people in Colombia, or rather, what Colombians would call Colombia, but they don't call it that way. These people have been around there for probably 2,000 or 3,000 years. And it used to be quite a large collective, also spatially, probably at least as large as Belgium, if not larger. And when the conquistadores arrived, the Spanish conquistadores, they were steadily pushed back. At a certain point in time, because they're a proud people, half of them committed collective suicide. They jumped off a cliff rather than submitting to the Spanish conquest. And these people now live in a reservation that is something like some 40,000 hectares, which is peanuts, in a mountain area close to an area which actually know quite well, that's called El Cocuy. And the Colombian Ministry of Education, of Mining, gave a company exploitation rights or drilling rights to see whether there might be oil next to these, to their sacred land. Now, in a certain sense, I'll come back to this in a case. It's a perfect example of what I think that Turner would call lex constructionis as part of lex mercatoria. In the case of lex constructionis, what you have is typically model contracts which are drawn up by a number of actors. In this case, it was the model contract drawn up by the International Federation of Construction Engineers. And what you have there in the case of lex constructionis, typically turnkey projects where a large international construction firm will move in, for example, make an airport or make a harbor or set up things in one way or another, large, massive turnkey projects. And what they will agree to is that if there is a conflict between the state and the construction company, then it will be submitted to arbitration. It will, in principle, not be addressed by the local judiciary system. This is also a kind of law that has, where it makes no sense to draw the distinction between the domestic and the foreign. What you have here is a legal order that has, in principle, a global reach. Now, I've already said something about the UA, and I've already mentioned that oil drilling rights have been granted by the Colombian ministry to drill and look for oil in a site contiguous to their sacred lands. What the UA did was to enter these drilling sites, knock down the fences, destroy machinery, and block roads, and so forth. And the government was going to move in with the army to clear the vicinities. And what basically the UA did was once again threaten with collective suicide. And because it was known that they had actually done so in the past, and because several NGOs began to very actively canvass in favor internationally of the UA, that petroleum company, oil company, was called Occidental Petroleum, ended up pulling out from Colombia, selling their drilling rights to Ecopetrol, which is a Colombian petroleum drilling company and exploitation company. And what was most interesting is what happened legally. Because there is an institution in Colombia that's called el derecho, or actually the acción de tutela, and that's a legal, a constitutional remedy which is granted to people that you can go in principle to any judge in Colombia when fundamental rights are in high danger of being violated, and you can ask for the suspension of either the law or the administrative act that would threaten in an irreparable way to destroy your rights, to suspend those acts while a full-fledged process gets going. Now, what was interesting was that the National Ombudsman in Colombia initiated action against the ministry, requesting that these drilling rights be suspended. But the UA did not participate. And why didn't they participate? Well, look at the article that was invoked by the National Ombudsman of the Colombian Constitution. Just read it. So what you have here is a balancing of interests. So what happens? If the UA go into these constitutional proceedings, then basically what they are accepting is that they're part of Colombia. And they are accepting that their interest has to be balanced with the interests of the rest of the country, such that perhaps they might lose the case. They refuse to participate because they refuse to accept the authority of Colombia. For them, they are conquered people. And the only way to avoid becoming really conquered is to show that system continuously that they are the conquered people, and therefore to refuse the authority of those who have subjected them, whatever the cost. And so they published a particularly interesting letter that is similar to the letter that was written by one of the Sioux Indian chiefs in the case of the American conquest. And their letter is La Carta al Hombre Blanco, the letter to the white man. And this is part of what you can read as their understanding of what they are about. Now, just a couple of sheets more and we're over and done with. Now, what I want to say is that their act is illegal. It's in the double sense. It's illegal to the extent that by entering the drilling sites, knocking down the fences, destroying machinery, it's clearly an illegal act, vandalism or whatever you want to call it. But it's not only illegal. They're entering Colombia from a place that is outside Colombia. And I'm not speaking metaphorically here. I think that their act challenges Colombian law. It challenges international law, because as you very well know, under international law, indigenous peoples have, and in general, minorities, have a right to internal self-determination, and there's only a right to secession under very specific circumstances, none of which would probably stand a chance in this case. But of course, that internal right of self-determination presupposes international law, presupposes the very fact of conquest, and that cannot be called into discussion as a reason for secession from Colombia. So they're calling into question Colombian law, they're calling into question international law, they're calling into question lex constructionis. And what I would want to say is that the fences which they push down manifest themselves precisely as being both limits and fault lines of globalization. And what this shows up is, I think, a huge problem in general in liberal theories of politics. We are obsessed by trying to make more inclusive legal orders which are more inclusive. So, for example, you will see Habermas trying to make sense of claims and contestations of boundaries in terms of, well, let's redefine the legal order in a way that is more inclusive. But what interests me, and I'm not trying to say that inclusion is not important, what about those cases where inclusion is not the solution to the problem, but the problem itself? So this brings me into the penultimate of the sheets, which is not to say that the last one is the ultimate sheet. Globalizations. We tend to use the word globe and world interchangeably. So we speak of the World Trade Organization, but we could have also spoken of a global trade organization. There's nothing wrong with that in itself. Linguistically, it's fine, but the problem is, of course, when we begin to take for granted that something like globalization means that the inside-outside distinction is fading. That brings us into problems because it helps to, in fact, efface this capital distinction between the own and the strange. And I would say that for phenomenology, phenomenological philosophy, it's clear that there's a category distinction between the globe and the world. The globe is a thing. It's a very large thing, but it's a thing. It's no different in principle to this thing. If I want to perceive this thing to handle the PowerPoint sheet, I can do it in two ways. I can myself circle around in all directions so I can perceive this thing from all sides, or as it were, I could hang it up from a string there, or rather, I could, sorry, that was the first way, or I could turn this around in all directions. The same thing would happen with the globe. If you were to send me on a rocket into a cockpit outside, I could have two ways of perceiving the globe. I could let it spin on its axis, or I could myself turn around the globe in all kinds of directions. But phenomenologically speaking, the world is not a thing. Phenomenologically speaking, the world is a nexus of meaning relations that allows us to see things, events, etc. So if you were to have taken one of the UA and assume that the UA would never have had contact with our Western understanding of what life is about, and you would have put that, you would have sedated that person, put that person in a cockpit, and then woken that person up and asked the person to look out the cockpit window, the person would not be able to say that he was or she was looking at the globe. Wouldn't know probably what she was looking at. If I can put it in hyperbole, for the astronomer, the world is in the universe. But in a certain sense, the world can only be in the universe of the astronomer because the universe is in the world of the astronomer. And that means that we need to draw a distinction between what Husserl would call Heimwelten and Fremdwelten, home worlds and strange worlds. And I think that what communitarianism is about as a normative project is to recognize that we cannot move beyond the distinction between the own and the strange, but to say, then let's save that plurality of home worlds such that each one is in place in his or her own home world. That's, for example, the move of people such as David Miller or Michael Walsh. What would cosmopolitans say? Cosmopolitans say, no, we need to move beyond that plurality of worlds and we need to understand emancipation as a process of trying to realize one world, one common world for us, one world that is the expression of our common humanity. What is the common presupposition of both communitarianism and cosmopolitanism is, of course, that notion of unity, in the sense that you can actually be at home in a single place, whether it be a home world vis-a-vis other home worlds, or a home world of all of humanity. I would want to defend a view which is alternative both to communitarianism and cosmopolitanism. I would want to view globalizations in the plural as processes of emergent intertwinements of Heimwelten and Fremdwelten. That is to say, we don't simply have a plurality of worlds. We don't simply have a situation where we're moving towards one world. We have worlds that meet and that don't meet. And because they meet and they don't meet, we can speak of intersubjectivity. And that's why we can speak of a dialogue, a dialogos, or rationality of the in-between. The last sheet. What does this tell us about democracy? Well, typically, democracy is defined as collective self-rule or collective self-legislation. A people gives itself its own law. Now, communitarianism, in line with what I have just said, would say, look, democracy is about self-rule, and basically in such a way that you include the own in the domestic, and you exclude what is other or strange, which has its place elsewhere. And in that way, you secure a plurality of worlds. And what a politics of boundaries is about is a process of making sure that we continue to police and to reinforce what is our own, and that we keep the other elsewhere. Cosmopolitanism has a more sophisticated understanding. Cosmopolitanism says, in fact, you cannot exclude without already having included what you have excluded. So at the very moment that you draw the distinction between the Netherlands and Belgium, you have already posited and presupposed a more encompassing unity, which is finally the unity of us as human beings. And what politics is about is making sure that our boundaries are reconfigured over time in such a way that if things go well, we could interchangeably understand each other as members of one common world. And so what a politics of boundaries is about for cosmopolitanism is a politics that aims to include what has been excluded, where the vanishing point is an all-inclusive legal order. What I would want to say is that if there's an alternative view, then it is because boundaries are even more sophisticated than that. Boundaries include and exclude, yes. To that extent, communitarianism is right. But boundaries not only include and exclude, they include what they exclude, but critically, they also exclude what they include. Let me give you a concrete example, and I'm almost finished. The European Union. What you see happening in the European Union is that the European Union has its boundaries, the external boundaries of the European Union. And so, for example, basically what remains the case, and this is visible now, certainly with the financial crisis, what the European Union is about still in the core is about realizing an internal or common market. So what you see happening is that the boundaries of Europe are posited in terms of an internal market and the rest of the world. So you have boundaries which include and exclude. But what the cosmopolitan will say is, but wait a minute, it's not only that they include and exclude. Look, you cannot close off Europe as an internal market without already including it and the rest of the world in a global market. And so the boundaries which include Europe and exclude the rest of the world include Europe and what is excluded in a more comprehensive whole. So that's as far as cosmopolitan takes us. But there's a further step, and that is to say, it's not only that we include Europe as a common market. In the very process of including Europe as a common market, we exclude other understandings of what makes us Europeans. And we also exclude other understandings of what could make us into a common humanity. So boundaries don't only include what they exclude, they will also exclude Europe in the process of including it as European Union. Now, if that is the case, then what this means is that what we have at the end of the day in terms of democracy is not only a process of a communitarian democracy that tries to police the boundaries of self and other. It's not merely a politics of boundaries in the sense of trying to have an ever more inclusive collective. It's a process of trying to re-articulate the own and the strange in the understanding that we are never entirely at home in what we call our own, and that what is strange is never only entirely strange. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hans. That was a lot to chew on. Is anyone done chewing? Another question? Nick, go ahead.
Thank you for, I think this is a hugely important discussion on boundaries that you're opening. What I'm going to do is try and better understand your understanding of the imperial in this, because on one hand I see two root tensions in what you're proposing on boundaries. On one hand there's an element of the Greek conception that boundaries always relate to the wall. And what's inside the wall is the stuff of politics, and the other stuff is outside of the community. Then there's the tension of the Roman vision of boundaries, which is that, well, they're out there, but they're constantly in the expanse, and they're constantly reaching out, and we don't define them quite as the wall. They're just the outer reaches, potentially always within our grasp. And your metaphor or your dichotomy that you set up, having legality and illegality, and the oppositions that you make, I wonder to what extent they underestimate the imperial quality of legality, in the sense that the law is always constantly trying to reach out and consume. And you touched upon that in the vagrant, talking about the possibilities, how the vagrant can be constructed. So how do you understand the imperial, or do you not? Just in that sense, I was curious.
Terrific. If you allow me, not a digression, but as a prolegomena for your comment, you must have read Arendt, because Arendt would typically draw the distinction, of course, between the Greek understanding of what law is about as a nomos, and she would refer in her Nachlass, in her unpublished manuscript, there's a little bit of a book that's called Was ist Politik, what is politics, where she explicitly refers also to the Roman understanding of law, where it's no longer the wall, but it's a promise, and therefore precisely allows for the all-encompassing nature of the law. Now, one fascinating aspect about Roman law, as compared to modern law, is the fact that the Romans had an exquisite understanding of boundaries, but they have a private law understanding of boundaries. They did not have a public law understanding of boundaries the way we have it in terms of the boundaries of Belgium or the boundaries of the Netherlands or whatever. Why? And the reason is, and this begins to bring us into the imperial character of it, because the boundaries between Rome and what was outside, the barbarians, were not legal boundaries. That was the frontier. And that is to say, it's only with the emergence of modern law, where you have an international legal order which encompasses states within a more encompassing space, that the external boundaries of states can appear as being legal, because you will have an umpire who can decide if there is litigation about which way the boundaries of a country runs, that will decide de jure what are the boundaries of that place. Now, what's interesting here about this situation, the notion of a frontier? There's, of course, the case of, and that brings us into the very notion of the core of empire. It also brings us into the core of in what way law itself might be imperial. Now, first empire as such, and then law as imperial. Now, as concerns the imperial character of the notion of frontiers, what I would want to say is that any boundary of a legal order that is spatial can appear as a frontier. What I call the frontier is the limit of that legal order. So in a certain case, in a certain sense, what happened when the clochard came into that restaurant, that threshold there appeared as a frontier. And what I mean to say by that is can actually be explained very easily in terms of Roman law. It was evident for the Romans that the positions inside Rome and outside were not interchangeable. When you left Rome, you left the domain of law. So there's a basic asymmetry between the positions inside and outside, and that asymmetry was also at stake in its own way in the framework of what that clochard was doing. In a very real sense, the clients and the other clients could not exchange our position with his. We could, of course, walk out that restaurant and come back in, but we couldn't do so in a way that was taking him to the place that he was coming to from and the place that he was going to in terms of his own distribution of space. So in that sense, what I would want to say is that the notion of frontier is a way of saying that law always has an imperial character in the sense that law always has frontiers in one way or another. Now, your question takes us a step further. Your question is, in fact, law will always say that it can address all of reality. And in that sense, it's imperial. And my answer would be yes. In a certain sense, what's interesting here is that because law will always organize behavior in terms of what's significant and relevant and important and what isn't, then the way that the law holds on to its imperial character is by simply ignoring whatever it is that lies beyond the scope of what it can deal with. And so what you will see happening in a lot of interesting cases is that claims will be made which are not even heard by the legal order. Doesn't mean that there isn't a normative challenge which is being raised, but as long as the legal order is strong enough and feels that it will be in a position to ignore that claim, then chances are that it actually will ignore that claim. And so in that sense, there is always an imperial core to a legal order, which manifests itself in how you respond to that frontier.
I was just, well, I have a little bit of an issue with the difference between, let's say, an illegality and just the dichotomy in the first place of a legality and an illegality.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about different orders and different, say, conceptions of law? Like, let's just take, I think he uses the individuation of different orders of law.
Mm-hmm.
That they're each kind of curtailed to a certain sphere, a certain discipline, say, a certain realm that they discuss. And that anything that's illegal, say, in one of those realms, might be something legal or illegal in another realm. So, like, to give a concrete example of, like, the vagrant, is that when he comes in, he may or may not have no conception or care for the space of the restaurant. Mm-hmm. And the person the waiter who gives him the food and agrees, may be doing it with no conception of the care of the space of the restaurant, but is using a different principle, a different realm of the set of rules that says, this is a hungry man, feed a hungry man. So this is now a legal rule. He's following the law. He's following the law of help this fellow man, and the other one's just not relevant. I mean, the reason I say this is I think your focus on space is fantastic. But one of the things I always think about when you think of space is that it's the relevance of at what scale you look at something, right? If you look at the universe, as you say, and then you look at the scale of that, and you see a world, it means a different thing than seeing on a continent. Or then if you keep going down and down and down, the space between things, the boundaries seem less of a boundary and more of the interaction between certain things. And I think that legal orders certainly do those things. I mean, they address those things, and the contestations and the boundaries and the transgression of boundaries that you're talking about aren't illegal. They're just, like you said, these intertwining of, I mean, am I just repeating what you're saying and you're just using the same kind of word or different kind of word for the same distinction? Or?
Yeah. Well, actually, you're raising a host of questions.
Yeah.
If you allow me, let me just parse at least some of them, and if I'm missing something, get back to me on that.
Later.
The reference to, let me say this. Of course, what I don't want to say is that there is an independent criteria that would allow us to say when something is illegal or legal and whenever it's simply illegal. Right. What I want to say is this. What you have is a fantastically interesting interplay between what I would call the precedence of the challenge and the retroactivity, if you wish, of the response. And I'm drawing here quite overtly on the work of Derrida. Nachträglichkeit. You'll remember the famous Wolfman case, Freud, which Derrida digs into in a beautiful way by saying, look, there's this kid that walks into his parents' bedroom who are having sex, and he's a toddler, and he's just horrified by what he sees, and it doesn't really register at that moment, but suddenly when that kid becomes a young guy, that begins to have retroactive effects, and what he saw is only visible, as it were, in the effects later on. Now, in a certain sense, what I want to say is that something like that is always happening also in the law. That means that, on the one hand, to come back to your question, the law can always present itself as being imperial, but in a certain sense, the possibility of illegality is given by the fact that what the law does is train us in expecting certain kinds of behavior. Unless law sort of normalized certain kinds of behavior, we would not have social expectations, we could not interact. But in a certain sense, illegal behavior is behavior that catches us by surprise because it's precisely what we couldn't expect. It's a possibility that the law hadn't opened up for us and suddenly we're floored by something that happens, like it happened to the waiter. The guy smiled at him and asked him to sit down to have dinner with him. Here was a possibility that the law hadn't opened up. And so, in a certain sense, there's something that always before the law, prior to the law, which is capable of surprising us because it comes from the domain of the unordered, which is the domain of a superabundance of possibilities which have been filtered out by a legal order. On the other hand, of course, if it were only that, then we already would know also in a certain sense when something is illegal or not. There would be a sort of mechanical reaction to it. But whether or not something is illegal is also determined in how we respond to it. So for example, we could ignore it. And then we would simply say this guy is acting illegally. What this guy did was something creative. And in that sense, there was a response to it, to its illegality, by in fact engaging in a form of a contract of donation. By saying, look, have a meal then. But in a sense, it's a creative response to a specific situation. And so whether an act is illegal or not is not merely a question of how that act presents itself to the legal order. It's also a question of retroactively how that legal order responds to that act. And in such a way that the two never completely meet. That's the first point. A second point of what you're saying is you mentioned the points of scales and boundaries and globalization. Now, if you look at the literature in legal of sociologies of globalization, think of Saskia Sassen, think of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, think of Günther Teubner, think of William Twining. What is ubiquitous in the literature is a reference to scales in law. But actually the notion of scales doesn't help us to understand what the experience is about that is at stake in globalization and the spatiality of globalization. Seems to me that what is at stake there is something quite different, and that Heidegger refers to in the notion of bringing close. That we are, as human beings, what we do is bring close, and in that sense, de-spatialize, in the sense of de-distancing. How does that work in terms of globalization? Of course, in a certain sense, you could say it's like what happens with these glasses of mine. Physically, when I put them on, there's of course what's closest to me. But to be able to see you, in a certain sense, the only way for me to see you is if these glasses are what is furthest away from me. What I precisely have no consciousness about, which allows me to see and live through those glasses, and only by living through those glasses, which are physically close to me, can I see you, and you are in a real sense much closer to me in terms of my attention than what my glasses are. Now, that's what happens with globalization. Thanks to technology, it's possible for us to engage in forms of collective action, where people who are in India are much closer to us in terms of what it is that we're trying to do together. For example, suppose you and I were the Via Campesina, one of these grassroots contestation movements against the World Trade Organization and so forth. If you're in India at this point and we're engaging with Skype with each other, and we are engaging with a network of people in Bolivia, in Chile, wherever, we are much closer to each other than perhaps the people here in the European Commission who are interested in doing some of the kinds of things that they are interested in doing. And so what globalization is about as a legal phenomenon in terms of spatiality is not so much a question of different scales of the law, as though you had small, large, or medium scales. It's bringing close in the sense of a span of attention, what may be physically far removed, but which is close in terms of our interlocking action in such a way that what is close by geographically can actually be quite irrelevant for what we're doing. So that's the way I think that we would need to approach the problem of globalization, of bringing close in terms of action what is far removed physically. Is this good for starters? What was the question that?
No, it's okay.
Yeah?
I don't want to take over.
Okay, good.
Okay, then I'll abuse my position with just one.
Uh-oh.
No.
Here's a dangerous systems theorist, mind you.
No, it's not even.
No. I'm being
Okay.
facetious.
No,
Please.
because I'm going to attribute to you something that you certainly don't think, but still. It's a notion of contestation, and contestation as something that is both necessary and constitutive of a political community. And I don't think this is what you mean, but you give the impression of saying, in the own strange distinction, the own is almost given. It is not a negotiable barrier. There is no contestation in defining the own. And when you talk of collective action being about a point, we do something together because there is a point to it, there is very little sense that that point can be contested, renegotiated, pushed out within the boundaries of the law. You seem to banish all sense of contestation to the sphere of illegality, to the strange.
Mhm.
And I wonder if that is what if that's really what it is you're trying to say.
Okay, terrific. Well, my argument would be yes, contestation is a moment of the strange, but the point is, of course, that the strange is within. That is to say, when I say that the foreign need not be strange and the strange need not be foreign, what I want to accommodate is the possibility, and that's why I'm both against cosmopolitanism and communitarianism, is that at the end of the day, both do actually believe in the possibility of having a neat distinction between the own on this side and the strange on the other side. What I would want to say is that the strange is always already within. And to give a couple of examples that I was discussing this morning in the workshop. If it is the case that we act as a collective, then of course the whole point is that someone has to say we on behalf of a we. We cannot say we on its own. Someone has to take the initiative to say we. And if someone takes the initiative to say we, there's no guarantee that the interlocutors or the addressees of that invitation to view themselves as a we are prepared to do so. And that means therefore that people will always be there in that collective who say, not in my name. I don't understand myself as being a member in the collective in the way that you understand it. Now, how does that pan out in terms of the point of joint action? What I would say is that what a legal order is a default setting of joint action, in such a way that when there's a moment of contestation, we no longer can take for granted what it is that we ought to do together, and we are, as it were, thrown back on ourselves and must ask the question, who are we? What is our joint action about? And then we can renegotiate the terms of joint action in such a way that hopefully we can reach an agreement about what it is that we ought to continue doing together. But to say that is also to say against communitarianism, cosmopolitanism, that there will not be a happy end situation or final situation where we would all have reached a situation of consensus. What I want to say is that there will be forms of contestation which cannot be accommodated in a legal order. And I gave this morning the example of Quebec. And I'll repeat the example. As you may know, the Quebecois separatist party in Quebec has been really moving to try to secede from Canada. And that some time back there was a situation where it looked like they might actually succeed in having a referendum where they would get a majority. Now, the Canadian government submitted a request for a reference to the Canadian Supreme Court, asking whether Quebec could secede unilaterally. And the Quebecois didn't participate. And they didn't participate for the same reason that the UA didn't participate. They say, wait a second, if I participate, I'm recognizing your authority, and that I'm part of Quebec or Canada, or that we UA are part of Colombia. We don't want to participate. It doesn't mean that we don't respect you Colombians, it doesn't mean that we don't respect Canadians, but we want out. So what I want to say is that if you really want to think radically about contestation, then that means that we have to accept that there's a strangeness within ourselves that we'll never be able to domesticate. That's what I want to say.
Right, sure.
Correct me if I haven't understood correctly, Professor Lindahl. When you talk about in advocating we together, I see that as an act of self-definition. Now, it creates problems in trying to understand the political, and it reinforces the friend and the enemy category, I think. And therefore, it then leads to what life is livable, what life is grievable, in trying to understand we, each and we together. And therefore, you know, when you talk about collective self-rule and collective self-restraint, that might also mean that the dominant will continue to dominate, and the marginalized will continue to see themselves from the gaze of the dominant. So, therefore, it remains unresolvable.
Well, thanks for this, because it allows me also to introduce an important reference once again to Carl Schmitt. For those of you who have read The Concept of the Political, a key book of contemporary political philosophy. In a key passage, what he says is der Fremde, der Feind. So the stranger, comma, the enemy. So what he does is to equate the strange with the enemy. That's precisely what I'm trying to move away from. What I would want to say is that the strange, one of the manifestation forms of the strange is possibly the enemy. And what I don't want to do is to try to puja the seriousness of his objection and say there are no such things as enemies. There definitely are situations of enmity. But I don't think that that is the primordial form of manifestation of the strange. I don't think that you can really say, I would say that what the Uwa were doing was a manifestation of strangeness. I don't think that you can say that the Uwa were enemies. Because for Schmidt, the enemy is not only what calls into question our understanding of who we are as a collective, but also does so in a way that is an existential negation of us, in such a way that it's either the enemy or we who survive but not together. What I would want to say is that that's one understanding and possibility of what the strangeness is about, but that in its fundamental understanding what strangeness is about is a form of contestation that shows us the contingency of the fact that we are a collective and what we are a collective, but it by no means requires a response in the sense of the annihilation of the stranger. And therefore what I mean by self-restraint is, for example, in the case of the Uwa, what would my blah 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 be quite concretely? What would self-rule and self-restraint mean with respect to the Uwa? I think that what it would mean is, for example, Habermas would speak about the Uwa as being a traditional collective. That is to say, when you speak about them as traditional, because we're modern, they're in the past. The Uwa are what we've managed to leave behind, and we are in a further process of emancipation than what these guys are. Now, I don't see that as being an adequate understanding at all of what was the normative challenge of the Uwa. In a very real sense, I think that the Uwa are our future. In a sense, what's their normative claim is, what are you doing to nature? And they wouldn't even call it that way because they don't make that distinction between physis and nomos, which we've inherited from the Greeks. They wouldn't make the distinction between nature and collectivities. They understand themselves very much as being part of what we would want to distinguish. In what sense are they the future for us? Well, in a certain sense, in terms of what we can respond to, because we simply cannot abandon science. We cannot abandon where we are and step back into the world of the Uwa. What they are our future are is in the sense of helping us to understand that we need to deal in a much more drastic way with problems of, for example, environmentalism. So in that sense, they're coming into our future and say where we should become, well, who we should become. So there is a measure of responsiveness in the sense that they are raising a challenge that we can respond to in terms of reordering ourselves. But at the same time, there is an aspect of the Uwa life, and I don't want to be particularly romantic about it here, but there is, in a very real sense, we cannot be where the Uwa are. And so then what would self-restraint mean with the Uwa? It would mean, for example, that you would not initiate criminal proceedings against the Uwa who destroyed property of the Occidental Petroleum or Ecopetrol. That you exercise self-restraint by not bringing the full weight of the law to bear on them, because that is precisely to take for granted they are already part of Colombia and that they should be understood as part of Colombia. What you could imagine yourself doing is, in a certain sense, compensating Occidental for what happened, the Colombian state, and withholding the application of criminal law with respect to the Uwa to let the strange be. Now, I'm not sure that that is a way of understanding the politics of boundaries which I'm trying to defend. That would be a question of trying to keep the marginalized group marginalized and the dominant dominant. To the contrary, it's probably trying to make sense of the fact that that we are radically finite in the sense that there are forms of contestation that we cannot respond to in the ways that the claim is raised, and therefore that we would need to recognize the finitude of our own legal order.
On that note, I invite you to join me in thanking Hans for a riveting few hours.